So he wrote the second great work called The Masks of God, which is in 4 volumes, and the first volume appeared in 1959, Primitive Mythology, and then that was followed by Occidental Mythology, which was the Western biblical world, and Oriental Mythology, and then he finished it up in 1968 with Creative Mythology, which was devoted to what Spengler would call the Faustian civilization. And Campbell saw the mythology of the Faustian civilization as unique in world history in that, for one thing, the myths have been secularized now. From the Grail romances on up, we have these sort of non-religious, non-institutionalized myths that are consistent with this Faustian destiny idea, that destiny unfolds from within the individual. And so that whole tradition of the Grail quest from Parzival down to our modern cinema is the sort of this idea of the individual going out, and it may really be that what Campbell is seeing in all the world's myths and tales is really a projection from his own culture of this Grail quest mentality. That's a debatable issue. So what I want to do then, the last thing that Campbell worked on before he died, and he died in 1987, was this thing called the Historical Atlas of World Mythology. And what it was essentially a rewrite of the Masks of God, except filtered in through the sort of these gigantic illustrations and maps and charts that you always find in these big illustrated atlases. And he was going to go through and survey the entire culture of the entire world, from the Paleolithic to the present day, and just trace every last bit of it out through this huge encyclopedic set. And he ended up finishing parts 1 and most of part 2, The Way of the Animal Powers and The Way of the Seated Earth. But as you can see, as he was working this out, he was also working out a theory of the evolution of consciousness implicit within human culture. And this sort of brings us back into the sphere of Spengler and Gebser now, with the transformations of human consciousness. And both Campbell and Thompson will be concerned and preoccupied with the mutations of the evolution of human culture. In the first phase, in The Way of the Animal Powers, we've already really looked at it with respect to the magical structure of consciousness that we've discussed with Gebser, because it's essentially the same thing. And in particular, that myth that I described about the buffalo's wife was the story that Campbell told most often to illustrate the central myth of The Way of the Animal Powers, which is this idea of a covenant that man has with the animal world, that if the animal gives its life willingly, then man in return gives it respect and propitiation through the performance of the ritual. And that has the magical effect of restoring the animal herds to life. And so the animal, the being rather, that is sacrificed in that tradition is the animal. When you move to the Agrarian Revolution, about 10,000 BC, when it begins to first spring into being, you begin to shift the cosmology into the way of the seated earth, where now the primary numinous fascination, each one of these things, the animal powers, the seated earth, the celestial lights, represent a kind of fascination that captures the consciousness of man such that it's a little bit like, how the imagination of children are caught by their toys and they're totally possessed by them. And they will even, sort of enact roles that they've seen from their favorite films and so forth. So too, man in his fascination with what is immediately most present, what is the immediate concern in his environment, tends to mythologize that which is his primary environmental concern. And the world of the animal species, man was a newcomer to the earth still during the great reaches of the Paleolithic, going back millions of years ago. If we trace hominid evolution, say we draw a line and we say 5 million years ago to 10,000 BC, the animal world was the primary concern, and survival within the animal world and life depended upon sacrificing these animals and living within them. So they sort of lived within the skins of the animals. They wore the animal skins. They built these mammoth bone huts that signified that the cosmology that they lived within was actually the body of the animal itself. They were sort of dwelling within it, the way in which we today are living within our machines. And so when we shift to the way of the seated earth, we shift to the Agrarian Revolution, and now the primary fascination for human consciousness is this mystery of the plants coming up into being, going through what Goethe called the metamorphosis of plants, their life cycle. And so the plants become mythologized now, and the primary sacrifice then is the plant, but the plant is personified in these myths as though it were a human being. And this is the ultimate origins of the plant god myths that you get in, for example, Dionysus, who is the god who lives in the vine, and the smashing of the grape to make the wine is the tearing apart of Dionysus in his reconstruction. And the myth of the death and resurrection of Dionysus is the visualization of that, of the divine. And there's a little myth that he used to tell about the Polynesian culture that illustrates this, where the story goes that this young woman was bathing in her favorite pool one day, and felt this eel brush up against her. And the eel transformed itself into a human being, and the human being became her lover. And so this relationship goes on for a while, and then one day the human being comes to her and says, what I want you to do is cut off my head and bury it. And she agrees to this, so she chops off his head, buries it, and then she comes back one day and finds the first coconut tree has grown up out from the head, and you can still see the god's face on the little coconuts that are on the tree. So the fascination there is that there's this numinosity, this numinous being that lives within the plant, and the plant now is the being which offers itself to the human in the sacrifice of its life in order to for the human to live. So the shift is from the animal as sacrifice to the plant as sacrifice. And you can recognize in that tree springing up from the head, by the way, the cross on which Christ hangs springing up from the skull of Adam. Traditionally in the classical art, you always find the skull of Adam at the very bottom of the hill of Golgotha, because the sort of Adam, Christ is the second Adam, the new Adam who has come to redeem the fall of the first Adam. And we are, when we are taking the communion meal, we are, it's an echo of this eating the plant god that goes way back into this agrarian religion. The sort of, you might say in Gebzerian terms, the deficient mode of this structure of consciousness is human sacrifice, which now begins to come in for the first time. And the human is sacrificed because of this fact that the human can embody the plant, and the human is analogized to the plant. And then in the sacrifice of the human, you are performing the myth of the sacrifice of the plant. So there's a dark, bloodthirsty aspect to this mythology that generally sinks its way into the world's tropical cultures. You find this. Then we get about 3500 BC, the shift into the way of the celestial powers, where the new environment of absolute fascination is the study of the heavens. As we have seen, this corresponds to Gebser's transition. These first two correspond more or less to the magical consciousness structure. The seated earth partially overlaps with the mythical consciousness structure, but the mythical consciousness structure is in full form with the way of the celestial powers. And this idea, when Leonard Woolley discovered these Sumerian mass graves, where they would have the king and the entire court would drink poison, and they would all die, and they would bury them and put this lid over them. What was found about that was that they were performing the myth of the circle of planets. And what planet is doing what cycle depends on which situation we're talking about. The king would sometimes, for example, as Fraser says in The Golden Bough, sometimes in India they would kill the king every 12 years based on the cycle of Jupiter. Sometimes it's linked with the 8-year Venus cycle that we talked about yesterday, and very often the king would personify the moon initially, later the king would personify the sun, and his primary consort was usually the personification of the planet Venus. And so they would wipe the whole court out when they would mark a full circle coming around, depending on how they were drawing the configuration, and the entire court would be wiped out. And, but they began to stylize this now. This is usually something that takes place, and it took place in early Egyptian, what Spangler would call the pre-culture phase of Egypt, the pre-culture phase of Sumer, the pre-culture phase of China. They all practiced this myth of the killing off of entire courts. But as the civilization moved out of its barbaric phase into its early culture periods, speaking in terms of Spangler, they began to stylize this myth and stopped taking it so literally, and then they performed it in a symbolic, ritualistic way, so that the king's ascent up the throne and the coronation of the king becomes the stylized symbolism of that, instead of actually literally killing off people. Although there was probably an interim period where, instead of having nobility do this, they would bring in lower people and sacrifice them off before they would shift over into this full stylization. So that's the way of the celestial powers. And then this is the primary inspiration for civilization clear up until the way of man, which Campbell also called creative mythology, which corresponds to the Faustian culture with this idea of this new, that the art and literature of Northern European civilization constitutes a kind of secular mythology. And so that very often you're reading texts which, whether you're reading Faust or Moby Dick or Paradise Lost or things of this sort, you're reading the sacred texts of Northern European civilization.